Hello everyone, my name's Colin Foreman and I'm the editor of MEED, and welcome to this MEED webinar on the Saudi Giga projects and their latest updates. This webinar is part of a series. We've been doing these for quite some time now. About a month ago, myself and my colleague Ed James presented a webinar on Saudi Giga projects with a focus on the World Cup and the 2030 Expo. This webinar will just be presenting an update on the Giga projects, a review of last year, and a few interesting updates that have happened recently. If you look at this opening slide, you will see quite an interesting image. This is the recently released designs for the Mohammed bin Salman Stadium at Kidia. I've been told for quite a few months that the design of the stadium was particularly iconic and different. I wasn't quite expecting the image that came through when the official announcement came through a few days ago. And as we can see, it really is a very different stadium to what we're used to seeing. It's built on top of a mountain section on the outskirts of Riyadh, and the actual structure itself is very different. And I put this image there really just to show the scale and the ambition of a lot of the projects that are going on at the moment inside the kingdom. Really, they're quite challenging in terms of what they make you think about Saudi Arabia, and also just in terms of the construction market in general. So I thought that was a good image really just to start the presentation with. If we then, this webinar is part of a series, as I said. What MEED will be hosting in May is the Saudi Giga Projects 2024 Forum, but also the MENA Construction Summit 2024. That's in the 13th and the 14th of May in Riyadh. It's an event we held last year, which was very well attended and very interesting. There was key participation from stakeholders in Giga projects in Saudi Arabia. Some highlights that I remember from the event were the outline of plans for the expansion of Jeddah Airport, and also quite a lot of development in and around Riyadh. So that was projects like King Salman Park, and also briefings from Giga project developers such as Roshan, Red Sea Development Company, which is now known as Red Sea Global. So a lot of interesting things that came out from that summit. And I would imagine with the amount of activity that's going on in Saudi Arabia this year, it will be exactly the same in May. Another thing that MEED's been working on is a Saudi Giga Projects 2024 and beyond report. That's now available to buy, and there's a special promotion here for people that attend the webinar, which runs up until the 5th of February. It's really quite challenging at the moment to keep track of everything that's going on inside Saudi Arabia in terms of progress on the Giga projects, and it's very useful to have a document that really pulls it all together. So now let's look back to how 2023 went. 2023 was really a very exciting year. As the editor of MEED, I'm still a journalist, and I have to say that it was the most exciting year I've had covering projects in the Middle East. When we look back to some of the booms that we've had previously, the sort of 2014 era, it's vastly exceeded that and set a new record in 2023 in terms of new contract awards. And interestingly, it's also surpassed the previous boom that was during the global credit boom of 2003 to 2005, when people will remember there was a lot of activity in markets such as Dubai, but also the rest of the region. So 2023 was the best year for contract awards on record, over $200 billion. Possibly that's a little bit of inflation when you compare it certainly to the 2003-2005 era, but a very, very busy year on record indeed, and Saudi Arabia played a very key role in that performance. If we just look at the sort of what was driving those awards in terms of countries, it was really the Saudi market and the UAE that had record years that really drove the market to new heights. Saudi Arabia and the UAE tend to be the most active markets in the region, and after a couple of years of high oil prices, that really spurred a lot of investment into capital expenditure projects in both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Also worth noting that other markets also perform quite strongly, although they are smaller markets. So, for example, you had a lot of LNG contracts signed in Qatar. As far as sectors are concerned, construction remains the largest sector, although it's quite fragmented when you compare it to, say, some of the other sectors such as oil and gas, which tends to be a bit more lumpy and have very large projects, but not so many of them. If we look across different real estate markets, Dubai was really the market that was leading in terms of private sector development when it came to real estate. However, in Abu Dhabi, there was a lot of GRE-related investment activity in real estate. And then in the Saudi market, which we'll be talking about later, the market's driven quite strongly by government-related entities developing real estate projects. So today we're talking about Giga projects, possibly a webinar all on its own. What is a Giga project? The easy way to dodge that question is to say, well, there's 5 official Giga projects which were outlined by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. They are NEOM, the Red Sea Global projects, Derria, Kidia, and Roshan. However, the answer is probably a bit more complex than that when you're looking at the market closely every day. There's a lot of other very major projects that have been launched over the last few years, which are similar in scale to some of the Giga projects. So it's a difficult thing to draw a line exactly what constitutes a Giga project. Some of those other ones that we could talk about are Saudi Downtown Company, which has a lot of projects dotted around the kingdom. New Murabba, which people will remember was launched about a year ago, which has the cube-shaped Mukab building. And then other developers such as Seven, which is developing entertainment clusters, and other developments as well, which have been launched, such as King Salman International Airport, which aims to be the largest airport in the world. And on top of that, we do keep hearing that there's other projects in the planning stages which haven't materialized into actual real projects yet. So there's a lot more things to come. So 5 official Giga projects, but lots of other things that could probably be classified as Giga projects as well. In terms of where they are, I think it's quite important to note that Saudi Arabia is a very big country and the projects are spread around the kingdom. This is quite different to what we've seen in the GCC region previously, where if we've been, say, talking about the Dubai market or the Qatar market, it was very centralized on a single city. What's happening in Saudi Arabia at the moment is projects being developed in all different parts of the kingdom. Obviously, there's a lot of development focused in the Riyadh airport. As I'd already mentioned, there's projects such as Kidia, King Salman Airport, Roshan has developments, New Murabba. But also you have projects that are in further parts of the kingdom, so such as NEOM in the northwest, the Red Sea projects on the Red Sea coast to the west, and then in other cities such as Jeddah and in the Eastern Province. So a lot of work across the kingdom. So it really is a countrywide development program which is going on at the moment. Okay, this brings me to the first poll question, which should be coming up onto the screen now. And the question is, do you think there will be more contract awards in Saudi Arabia this year compared to last year? And it's a simple yes or no answer. We should be seeing the results soon. Well, that's really quite a decisive answer. 91% of people think that there will be more contract awards this year. I personally am inclined to agree. If you look at the way activity is building in the kingdom, there's a lot of momentum gaining and a lot of projects are building up to critical mass. So I think that's probably my view as well, that there will be more contract awards this year. We've set the scene in terms of what happened last year. I'm now going to zoom in a little bit on a couple of projects specifically. Both of them are in Riyadh or the Riyadh area. The first one that I'll look at is Derria Gate, which is being developed as a mixed-use heritage and tourism destination, which is built on a historical site on the outskirts of Riyadh. It's being financed through a mix of government funds and the PIF. It was started in about 2019, and certainly it's going to be substantially complete by 2030. There's 3 different phases at the moment which are ongoing, which are known locally really as DG1, DG2, and DG3. A lot of work's already going on site. I visited there at the end of last year, and there's some substantial construction projects going on there. Perhaps the most obvious and the most recognizable is the super basement, which is an enormous piece of concrete work, which they say is going to be the world's largest car park, which is well in the execution phase. But then there's a lot of other development around the Derria area. So there's Wadi Safar, which is quite a sprawling wadi that passes out from Riyadh, which in itself is probably a day trip just to have a drive around, which includes a Greg Norman designed golf course, which is very well advanced. If you visit there, you'll be able to see the golf course is pretty recognizable now. As of January this year, there've been approximately $5 billion worth of contracts awarded, and some really quite big names in terms of contractors that are working there. If we can see that at the bottom, as I said, there's WeBuild, there's China State, Al Bawani, El Saif, Nesma, Al Rashid, and several others as well. One interesting thing about the Derria project is the heritage connection. There's At Taraith, which is a historical site. Those of you that are interested in history, it's well worth visiting. I visited there a couple of years ago. There's been an extensive restoration project which has now been completed there, and it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there's been quite a lot, as well as the sort of physical infrastructure in renovating the site. There's also guides and things like that who can help you understand really the historical significance of it, and how it comes back to basically the Riyadh and that area becoming the first capital of what would later become known as the modern Saudi Arabia. One other area at Derria which is now open and operational is Bajari Terrace, which is the promenade of restaurants, which opened about 2 years ago. Again, just giving a bit more critical mass to that area and opening the project up so people can visit and see that it's actually a live construction project and something that's being delivered, whereas perhaps 3-4 years ago it was really still very much just a concept. Here we can see a combination of photos of stuff that's going on actually on site at the moment, and some of the project plans for some of the areas in the future. In terms of contract awards, the super basement, which I mentioned earlier, is the largest contract award that's been signed so far, which is being executed by Italy's WeBuild. There's significant other infrastructure packages that are ongoing. I think if I was going to just comment personally on this one, I think my perception of the Derria project for a while that it was very much a large sort of retail and entertainment development on the edge of the city, which had a heritage focus. But really it's much more than that, with the things like Wadi Safar and DG2 and DG3. It really is a much larger master plan development, which is really its own district, and perhaps in terms of scale, it's sizable enough to be its own town or settlement. So it really is a very big project, and obviously large projects with covering a large area require an awful lot of infrastructure before they can really get going in terms of being building projects. So that's why on this list you see a large amount of heavy construction and infrastructure work leading the sort of the development phasing. In terms of what's happening at the moment in terms of tendering, you're starting to see some more building packages coming through, which is what you would expect once the infrastructure starts to be completed. Here we can see some analysis. As I said, there's quite a number of leading contractors in the chart on the right-hand side, again led by WeBuild, and a mix of other internationals, but also quite a lot of local contractors engaged extensively on the project. For future work, there's quite a bit of work at the moment, which is in the bid evaluation phase, which is expected to be awarded very shortly. We're aware of a couple of major packages which are very close to being awarded. So it looks like there's going to be a strong year from Derria in terms of contract awards going forward. And then as the master plans roll out even further, that should be sustained over the next few years. The super basement that I was talking about, you can see that there on the left-hand side. Like often with photographs, that photograph does give you an idea of the scale of the work that's going on. However, it doesn't really impress on you quite as much as when you're actually there, just how big, and probably more importantly, just the volume of concrete that's being poured to deliver that scheme. It's really quite an enormous undertaking. Again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of infrastructure work which is continuing for the second phase of the Derria Gate developments. At the moment, that's mostly on the infrastructure side of things. And then there's also work that's supporting infrastructure again, which is with the National Water Company and other utility providers. And that work's all going on across the site at the moment. One important development that was announced this week is the completion of the tunnel on the Western Ring Road, and that's now been completed. This is quite an integral part of the project. The project's located to the side of the Western Ring Road, and the site will have access over the Western Ring Road in the future. So being able to put that highway under the ground and then develop on top of it was quite an integral part of the master plan. So this has been quite a challenging piece of work to do for a number of reasons. One, there's the actual construction work itself, but then, as always is the case with highway upgrades and highway changes, you've got to deal with existing traffic and things like that. So that with this project now entering the final stages, it's quite an important moment for the Derria project. And then sitting on top of that will be a boulevard, I think would probably be the best way to describe it, which is known as the Heroes Park, which will connect Riyadh into the broader Derria development. This is more infrastructure work, which is being done by China State with El Safe, which again is advancing on site quite significantly. There's also been provision built into the master plan for metro stations. One of the key things which is happening in Riyadh at the moment are the procurement is starting for extensions to existing metro lines. So that's line 2. There's also talk of a line 7. And then there's another rail scheme which is also being talked about. Metro links are quite important for the Derria development to provide connectivity. So the station boxes that are built into the design there already in the construction phase, and then they'll be ready for the metro projects once they move into construction. So these are quite forward-thinking and important parts of the infrastructure development plan for Derria. There's also headquarters building for the Ministry of Culture and Information. This was awarded in November 2022, and progress is already being made on this site. This is one of the earlier building projects, but as I said earlier, as infrastructure work starts to become more advanced, I expect to see a lot more building work on site in the future. And here we can see some images of the building work that's already started. Another major development in the Riyadh area is Kidia. At the beginning of the presentation, you'll have seen on the first slide, there was a picture of the recently released details of the Mohammed bin Salman Stadium. Kidia is a slightly different development to Derria. Derria is very much sort of heritage focused. Kidia is more sports and entertainment, and it's slightly further out of town. It's about 45 kilometers away from Riyadh city centre. It's a PIF subsidiary, which is Kidia Investment Company. And the original master plan was split into 6 areas. There was an eco core, a motion zone, a resort core, Kidia Village, which was the sort of city centre, as it were, a golf community, and an aerodrome and airfield. There are about 17 projects in the execution phase at the moment. Most notable of these are the Speed Park and the Six Flags theme park and the water park. There's about 6 billion worth of contracts have been awarded so far, which is a similar value to what we'd seen earlier, if you remember, on the Derria project, where there's been about 5 billion. If we look at how the awards have been flowed so far, a lot of them are on the sort of leisure and infrastructure side. Kidia was relatively quick to get going on a couple of initial infrastructure packages, but these were followed quite quickly by contracts to build actual leisure assets. So the first one was for the Six Flags theme park, which went to a joint venture of Bouygues and Al Mabani. It was quite an interesting deal, as it was supported by UKEF, which I think was quite an important deal. And I think bringing Bouygues into the project, and also Bouygues re-entering the Saudi market, was quite an important moment. Those of you that were in the market 2-3 years ago will remember there was a lot of concern that international contractors wouldn't want to get involved in projects in Saudi Arabia, and Bouygues was one of the first ones to really take on a major project. So I think that was quite a landmark moment looking back at the Saudi market. Since then, other major contract awards for leisure assets, there was Alec and Al Saif picked up the water park, and more recently they picked up the Speed Park, which is the buildings associated to the Formula One circuit. And then, of course, obviously a greenfield development, if you want to call it that. There's also an awful lot of infrastructure work that's been required. So at the moment, the split is about 4.2 billion of leisure buildings and 1.6 billion of infrastructure. As I'd mentioned, the contractors there, Al Saif, largely due to their JV activity with Alec, is the most prominent contractor. Alec, a UAE-based contractor, a regional player, is heavily engaged there. And as I said, Bouygues, I think, was really quite an important appointment. There's also China State, who, like Alec, are operating there in joint venture with Al Saif. They've picked up an e-games arena there. So there's a good spread of local players and international contractors taking part, which, like I said, 3-4 years ago, it wasn't entirely certain who would be stepping up to do all this work. Here we can just see a little background on where the site's located in relation to Riyadh, which makes it a little bit different to the Kidia development, but it's still within striking distance of the capital. And unlike some of the other projects which are in very remote areas, it's still serviceable from an existing construction market and supply chain. One project that's going to be quite important to Kidia's success, those of you that know the Dubai market well, Dubai built a theme park, the Dubai Parks and Resorts, which opened in 2016 or 17, if I remember correctly. One of the challenges that park had in terms of operations was it wasn't particularly easy to access for people that weren't driving. So this Q Express project, which is a rail line that leads out to Kidia, will be quite important to certainly the theme park's performance once they open, as it will be able to bring people into use them without necessarily driving themselves. at the moment, there's an alignment which is being talked about, which will take it from King Salman International Airport, which is the name for the expanded King Khalid Airport. So the existing airport's King Khalid International Airport. Once that's expanded, it will become King Salman International Airport. And that rail line will be a high-speed express line, which will take people from the airport through Riyadh and into Kidia quickly. In terms of work awarded, as I outlined, a heavy percentage of it is leisure buildings and attractions, which is quite important that once these things are finished, then Kidia will become an attraction in its own right. So in the next couple of years, you're going to have operational assets in Kidia, and it will move from becoming just a construction project into becoming an operating destination. So that's going to be quite an important moment for the development in the next couple of years. That's not to say that development at Kidia is going to stop at anything, but it's going to be still a very busy construction site with lots of major projects going on. But the mix will change a little bit as assets open and start operating. In terms of future contracts, in terms of our database, still the majority of it is sitting in the design phase. There's about 6% at bid evaluation or $500 million, which means that's going to be or expected to be awarded fairly quickly. There's another 320 million, which is at the bid stage, so that should still be awarded fairly promptly, but a little bit further down the line. And then in PQ, there's just over $1 billion or $1.3 billion worth of work. So there's quite a lot of work there which should realistically be expected to be awarded over the next year to 2 years. As I said at the beginning, this is the recently released details of the Mohammed bin Salman Stadium. Again, a very challenging project, capacity of 45,000. Interestingly, the legacy use, they've said it will be used by Saudi Pro League clubs Al Nassr and Al Hilal. So that really settles some of the legacy questions that you normally get with some of these new projects, particularly in the sporting arena, that there will be an end use once the project is, a consistent end use once the project is completed. On top of that, it's earmarked to be used for the 2034 Asian Games, the 2027 AFC Asian Cup, and although the bid document for the World Cup 2034 hasn't come out yet, I'm certain it will be a strong contender to be one of the venues for World Cup matches. As I said earlier, there's the Six Flags theme park. This is under construction at the moment with Bouygues, and there's some images just to give you an idea of what that's going to look like. This is the water park which I mentioned, which is being done by a joint venture of Elsafe and Alec. There was also a water park hotel which was awarded last year, which is now under construction, which was secured by Qatari contractor UCC. This is the speed park and the Formula One racetrack. I expect that Formula One races will be hosted here in the future once this development's completed. And this is the E-Games arena, which I mentioned had been secured by Elsafe with China State. So a lot of things now which are in the heavily into the construction phase and should be delivered in the next 2 to 3 years. So again, moving from being just a construction project into an operational asset. Interestingly, the stadium is in the procurement phase as well. The main stadium, the Mohammed bin Salman Stadium, that's using an early contractor model again, which I think was used for the speed park. We're seeing this more and more in the kingdom of client bodies using alternative procurement routes to try and secure contractors' involvement. Largely, it's an overheated market. Contractor services are in short supply when you compare it to the number of projects that are ongoing. So to give contractors a level of comfort, better understanding about what the projects involve, and also help the clients develop a bit more cost certainty. We're seeing this early contractor involvement being deployed quite a lot at the moment. So that's a good example of alternative procurement methods being used in Saudi Arabia. And that brings us on to the second poll question. On which of these products would you like to receive more information, if any? And these are MEED products. The first one is MEED.com. The second one is MEED projects. The third one is Premium Intelligence Reports, which includes the Saudi Giga Projects 2024 report. And the fourth one is the Saudi Giga Projects and MENA Construction Summit in 2024, which, as I mentioned, will be in Riyadh in May. I'd like to vote there. And then I will move on to Q&A. But before I move on to Q&A, there's one other thing I'd like to just cover. I think one thing that's going to be an important topic of discussion throughout this year is going to be the phasing of delivery of projects. We saw at the end of last year during the Saudi budget statement that the Minister of Finance said that projects may have to be delayed beyond 2030. His comments suggested that a lot of that will be projects that have not yet been announced. But the fact that he was saying that suggests that there are real concerns within the kingdom in terms of delivering everything that they want to deliver by 2030. And there's a sense now that some projects might get rescheduled or some of the phasing altered. So I think that's going to be an important thing to watch. I think it's important for the construction industry because you want to make sure as a company that you're operating on a project that still remains a priority and gets delivered. So I think that's really one thing to watch. Overall, I agree that the market outlook's very positive. And as we saw earlier, 91% of the viewers that are watching today think that there's going to be more contract awards this year than last year. However, I think it's important just to keep that question in the back of your minds in terms of what happens with phasing in projects over the next year or so. And with that, we will move on to questions and answers. Okay, there's a question here that says, how are Giga projects related to the energy and power sector? That's, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. However, if you look at some of the larger developments, and when I say larger, I mean incredibly large, like the 500 billion NEOM project in the northwest of Saudi Arabia, that's such a large project, it's almost its own country. And because of that, it has an awful lot of energy, power, and utility requirements, which it really has to build from scratch. It's almost a completely greenfield site. So in the case of NEOM, they have a subsidiary, Enowa, which is handling a lot of what their utilities are going to be in the future. There's a strong focus, certainly at NEOM, on it all being renewable energy. So that's very different to what we've seen in development in previous decades. Moving further down the coast, the Red Sea project, again, they have to consider energy and power as well. Also, like NEOM, they're very focused on renewables and are quite advanced. I visited the Red Sea project last year. There are 2 large solar farms, if you want to call it that, of PV. And there's a battery energy storage system, which is up and operational. So yes, energy and power is important for these developments. I think it's particularly important for the developments which are in remote locations where really they have to build it themselves. If you look at the developments that are in sort of on the existing grid, if you take Derria, for example, there's a lot of things like substations that have to be built, also substations relocated in some of the existing areas. So there's a lot of projects in the power sector and energy sector that are related to these Giga projects, but not all of them are in exactly the same way. They all have their own sort of individual flavor and mannerisms. There's a question here, given the increase in Giga project awards and contracts, is there sufficient financing to support these projects and strong banking system to complement? This is a really good question, and I think one that's going to be continually asked throughout the development of Giga projects. I think that if you look at the scale and the ambition of the projects, it's a large volume of work, which obviously costs a lot of money. And the nature of the projects as well is particularly complex and challenging, which means they're not cheap buildings to build. So naturally, the question is, how's this going to be paid for? Most of the development work that's going on at the moment is backed by the public investment funds. Certainly the 5 official Giga projects are, and a lot of the others are as well. I see that morphing going forwards. I think what we will see in the future is a greater percentage of private sector involvement. If we look at what's happened in development across the region in the past, you tend to have a government-related entity which establishes the infrastructure and builds some of the key building assets just to get the development up to a point of critical mass where, if you remember, I mentioned at Kidia, it sort of moves from being just a construction site into an operational asset. I think once you get to that point, you'll start to see third-party private sector investors coming in to acquire plots of land, develop assets themselves. So I think the burden of development will be dissipated a bit over the next few years as infrastructure and buildings are completed, and crucially as projects or Giga projects move from being construction sites into operational assets. That's important because investors will see an actual living, breathing development rather than just something which is a promise and a construction site. In terms of the banking system, Saudi Arabia's banking system is quite strong. I think the difficulty in terms of banking over the next couple of years is going to be for contractors. I think the construction industry has come off the back of quite a prolonged period of difficulty, certainly since mid-2014 till really 2021. The market conditions for construction companies have really been quite bad. A lot of major players, if you look around the region, have gone out of business or had crippling financial issues. On top of that, the entire supply chain below it has been starved of cash. So it's not really been an industry that people have wanted to invest in or had much cash flowing through it. And as a result of that, I think the banking system will be a little bit reluctant to provide financing to all the construction companies as they look to gear up to work on projects. And I think this is going to be something that sort of just quietly plays in the background, which is going to hold back the pace of development. I know certainly this has been raised with the authorities, but it's quite a difficult problem to solve because you've got a lot of smaller entities who might not have particularly strong financial records and things, and the banking system is going to naturally be quite reluctant to support some of those companies until their performance really starts improving. There's a question here on 5-star hotels under construction ends it this year. That's quite a specific question. I can get back to you on that, but in terms of 5-star hotels under construction, off the top of my head, there's several at the Red Sea project. There are some at Derria, which are in the advanced construction stage and should be completed this year. But specifics I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Project values were, yes, they were given in US dollars. Rua Medina projects, I can give you a quick overview. Rua Medina is a large development in Medina, Holy City. It's in very simple terms, it's a very large real estate development, which is mixed use. So there's commercial space, residential, hospitality, retail. It tends to be it's covering quite a large area. Building heights from memory are up to about 18 stories. In terms of construction, it's split up into various districts and super blocks, and they're starting to move into construction now. And there's some major tenders out for super blocks, which involve a lot of construction. So that one super block, for example, will have 10 to 20 hotels in it. So large chunks of construction work coming out from Ruhr Al Madina. There's a question here saying, are there any projects that are being shifted from 2030 to 2040 deadline? I'm not aware of any projects having their deadlines changed. I think the goal will remain that projects need to be completed for 2030, but the more nuanced answer will be how much is delivered by 2030. I think we've already seen across a number of projects across the kingdom that there's first phases and phases of development which are given priority for 2030. Okay, there's a question here about whether a company should establish a manufacturing facility in Saudi Arabia. I think the answer to that question is really if you're setting up a factory which is going to serve projects and you believe that these projects, the pipeline's strong enough going forward, then that would make sense. The question then says that Japanese companies have decided to set up manufacturing sites. I think that's really going to be on a case-by-case basis. I think that it really is a case of if you can see that there's a long-term market there in Saudi Arabia, then it will be an attractive thing to invest in. I think really if you take a step back from the Giga projects, it's easy to be a little bit blinded by some of the imagery and the complexity of the projects involved. If you take a step back for a second, Saudi Arabia is still quite a large population compared to the rest of the GCC. It's a young population which is growing. So there's quite a large demand for infrastructure and basically just consumption going forward. So I mean, and that'll include everything from whether it be automotive, housing. So it's a growing market which is backed by strong fundamentals, and then layered on top of that are these giga projects. So I think a lot of the time that the answer to the question about whether they should invest or not isn't really a giga project question. It should be one about whether you believe in the fundamentals of Saudi Arabia, and the sort of the economics underneath it is quite compelling. Again, we've had a question about power plants, and it's also asking about water treatment. Again, that all these large projects require all of that. There's an awful lot of utilities and infrastructure that's required for such major projects. Another interesting question which is coming through is in terms of where a contractor's coming from. I think that's something that we're beginning to get a lot more visibility from. When the Giga projects were first launched in 2017, the Saudi market was one where Saudi Bin Laden and Saudi Oje, which have been the two dominant contractors in previous years, were no longer operating at the strength that they used to be in. In fact, Saudi Oje effectively went out of business. And there was this question about which international contractors are going to step in. As I said, we've seen Bouygues being one of the first. WeBuild has picked up work at Derria, but also recently picked up a major order at Neom, which was about $4.7 billion worth of work. So we're seeing some major international players coming into the market at the moment. I think if I was going to just generalize in terms of countries that contractors are coming from, mostly it seems to be China is taking more and more of a dominant position. In the past, there's really been 2 or 3 Chinese companies that have worked in the region extensively. We're now seeing a lot more Chinese companies coming through as well, in addition to the 2, 3, 4 contractors that traditionally held quite a strong market share in the GCC. So I think Chinese companies will continue to play a very active role in projects in the kingdom. Turkish companies, after a few years of almost an unofficial blacklisting of Turkish companies on Saudi projects, they're coming back into the market quite strongly, and we're seeing them appearing a lot on bid lists. The other grouping of companies that we're seeing a lot of are South Koreans have come back to the market. There was a question as to whether they would again. They'd been active in the market at the sort of 2010 to 12 era, and then withdrew a little bit, but they're now becoming quite active again. Initially, that seems to be on the oil and gas side of things, but they're coming into a bid on work on the Giga projects as well. There's a question here about Kidia changing its plans for residents. Yes, there was a big announcement from Kidia with the Kidia City development, which people may have seen a couple of maybe a month, maybe 2 months ago, which showed it really quite clearly that there's now a district with a lot of high-rise buildings. So the question's referring to a large number of residents, 600,000 residents. So this city district, which has been released officially now, will account for that. There's a question there with the Giga project slide. Is that the final sponsors list? I would advise you to speak with our commercial teams there about sponsorship opportunities. Another question, any thoughts on how Saudi Arabia and the UAE will keep up with resources such as steel to execute construction projects? It's going to be a real challenge, and I think the answer to the question is going to be multifaceted. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been quite keen to develop domestic industries in critical areas. So both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have steel production, they have aluminium production, and do produce a lot of the other key building materials themselves domestically. And there's been a lot of investment into that. So cement plants, etc. Going forward, they're going to need all of that. I think there will be more investment into developing domestic capacity as it's required. I think as well, you need to also look at importing and setting up strategic alliances with countries that would maybe be able to export commodities and materials and equipment into Saudi Arabia and the UAE. One other thing which I think's an important trend, which is a broader discussion point, is over the last 2 years, you've really seen a lot more integration, within the GCC, but also within the broader Middle East. So if we take, for example, now there's, Bahraini companies being brought into the fold to work on Saudi developments and supply Saudi projects. And if we look at the broader Middle East, Egypt, I think, will play a key role going forwards. The Egyptian market's had a great period over the last 5 to 10 years of developing major projects. That market's cooling a little bit, and I would imagine that there'll be an awful lot of supply chain in Egypt going forward that'll be keen to engage on projects, particularly in Saudi Arabia. So I think domestic investment in strategic areas, just to make sure that there's a baseline of commodities and materials available, and then complemented with sort of strategic agreements regionally. And then, if needed, there's always the international sort of spot market, which is a little bit more varied. But if you've got a major project with a tight deadline, sometimes that's the way to go with things. A very broad question here: how is the NEOM project progressing? Quite quickly, actually. I think it's quite easy to sort of forget what's happening at NEOM, given the fact that it's in a remote location. There's an awful lot of contract award that's coming through out of NEOM now. As I said, most recently there was the $4.7 billion contract that was awarded to WeBuild week before last, and I think we will see a lot more major contract awards coming out of NEOM going forward, and that's across their various different developments. The the WeBuild contract was for dams at Trojena, which is supporting the Asian Winter Games in 2029. But we'll see other major contracts, for example, at Oxagon. There's a couple of major port projects which are at the tender phase, which will join two major packages which were already awarded and under construction. We'll see railway infrastructure, which is connecting Oxagon with the line. We'll see ongoing building work at the line start to move forward. Also tunneling work and infrastructure work for the spine, which is the sort of the rail corridor, which runs alongside the line. So an awful lot of work that's already ongoing at NEOM, and that will continue as a lot of these projects that are at the sort of the tender phase are awarded and move into construction. Next question, any update on NEOM? I just covered that. Red Sea Global. Red Sea Global, I think, is at an interesting point as well. As I said, it's very interesting to see projects move from being just construction sites into operational assets. That's happening now with Red Sea Global. They've got hotels opening. So Red Sea Global is no longer just a project or a construction site that we're talking about. It's now become its own destination. It has an airport which is operating. There are flights there which will bring tourists into it. So that is now an operating asset. So to some degree, the first parts of the Red Sea project are now delivered, and that doesn't mean that the development there is going to stop. There's still an awful lot of projects still in the earlier stages with Red Sea Global. So at the Red Sea project itself, there's hotel projects across the various island developments. Then, of course, there's the Amala development as well, which is another major undertaking where there's a lot of construction work, which is in the early phases and will be delivered over the next year to 2 years. So a lot of work and activity going on with Red Sea Global. The rig project, yes, that has surfaced back, as the question says. That was given almost a relaunch in terms of PR. My understanding is that there's been quite a few people working on the design and the buildability of that over the last couple of years. The fact they've effectively re-announced it suggests that it now has a bit more critical mass behind it. Okay, what is the impact of inflation and how resources can be managed for such huge projects? Inflation, yes, is an issue. Inflation's an issue globally at the moment, and really the world got used to zero interest rates and low levels of inflation, and that's no longer the case. I think the second part of the question, which then says how resources can be managed for such huge projects, is probably the important thing to talk about here. Obviously, inflation will be there, but I think the difficulty for development companies is securing resources. That cuts across a number of levels. So if we talk about contractors, we're seeing multiple delivery strategies. So Red Sea Global, for example, has packaged up work into smaller packages, which it then manages in-house as a construction manager. And typically that may involve, say, 20 packages per asset. On the other side of the equation, you're seeing developers now that are really parceling up larger pieces of development and putting that out to tender to try and attract very large international or regional contractors to come into the market. So that's this sort of super block idea where a developer will tender maybe 10 to 20 hotel buildings all at once and get a contractor to come in that's attracted to the scale and the pipeline of work that's on offer. So on the contractor side, there's two sort of schools of thought in terms of how the work should be packaged up. And then on the procurement side, there's sort of early contractor involvement to give it an extra degree of certainty. From the UAE, we've seen that in the past, in sort of 2006, 2007, 2008, development companies entered into partnering agreements with contractors to lock in contractor resource. I think that could well be an option for companies going forward. We've already seen PIF invest into 4 Saudi contractors to try and give it some more certainty when it comes to contractor resource. So I think there's going to be more movement in that space going forward. In terms of other resources, human resources seems to be okay from speaking to people. I think it is a challenge hiring people, and then there's a lot of poaching from within companies in Saudi Arabia. I think that the one particular source of frustration is consultants losing staff to development companies. That's one thing that I hear a lot of complaints about. In terms of labour force, I haven't heard too much in the way of challenges there in terms of securing labour. I think materials and basic commodities, there will be inflationary pressure there as the market heats up going forward. And again, there'll be various strategies deployed to try and mitigate that problem. There's a question here about Kidia Coast. There was some information that was leaked out on Kidia Coast, I think about a year ago. However, I haven't seen any official updates on that since then. Dammam and Jeddah. Dammam, there's quite a few projects going on there at the moment. And interestingly, there's a stadium development there which is just moving into construction. Jeddah, there's a lot of work coming through in Jeddah now. I think that perhaps 3 years ago it felt like in terms of cities, Riyadh was getting a lot of the focus. In the last 2 years, Jeddah's had an awful lot of announcements. MEED's reported recently on the contractors in front-running positions or being awarded significant work on the Jeddah Central development. There's also other projects which are moving ahead. Perhaps the most interesting one is the Jeddah Economic City in the world's tallest tower, which began construction just over 10 years ago and is now looking to restart. Contractors are bidding for that at the moment. So that's a major Jeddah project. I think once there's a contractor on board there and some of these other major schemes, such as the Jeddah Central, start moving into full swing, I think we're going to start seeing Jeddah as a major construction market in its own right. Data center projects, yes, there's a lot of data center projects which I'm aware of. In terms of specific details, I can't remember too many, but it goes without saying that there's an awful lot of development going on, and a lot of these developments do require data centers. I think there's also people coming in from other parts of the region to try and support the development of data centers in the kingdom. So I think that's quite an interesting area, but I don't have the specifics at hand. Can you give a little bit more detail on alternative procurement routes? I discussed that a little bit already in terms of early contractor involvement. I think there's going to be more movement on that going forward as this, particularly securing the services of main contractors, becomes more and more difficult as project activity in the kingdom ramps up. Another interesting question, which is very topical at the moment: do you think tension in the Red Sea will affect and contribute to the delays? At the moment, I don't think so. I think there have been some supply chain challenges encountered due to tension in the Red Sea. There's quite a lot of that being talked about in the sort of European and Chinese context. In terms of Saudi Arabia at the moment, I don't think it has had an impact. Where we're seeing some areas of discussion is that there's an impact on shipping costs. So anything going into the Red Sea, it now costs more to insure. So that is a problem. The other interesting thing, which I think will probably come from this, and we've seen it periodically in the past when there's been tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, is that alternative supply chains start to emerge. So at the moment, if somebody was relying on something being shipped and all of a sudden being shipped through the Red Sea becomes more expensive, I think you'll see alternatives, say an overland route being considered, shipping to another port and then breaking it down and then trucking it through. There'll be a lot of different supply chain solutions to this problem, but that's sort of assuming that the tensions continue for a long while. Do I know whether the Saudi government will announce new projects related to the pipe industry? I think there have already been some pipe manufacturing plants announced in the Eastern Province about a year ago. I could imagine there'll be more. I think they were being supported by Aramco, which is obviously an important end user for pipes. How are companies managing recruitment for projects? I think that's a multiple answer again. I think there's people that are managing that in-house and then also using agencies. I think there's a growing number of people coming from outside the region to work in Saudi Arabia, just as the number of people that are needed increases. And then again, as I said earlier, one of the sources of tension is companies poaching people from others from within the kingdom. Question here about how companies can get pre-qualified. Certainly the Giga projects and the PIV projects, they all have websites with procurement portals which allow companies to register themselves to work on projects. So my advice would be to spend a little time just on their websites and getting registered with their procurement portals. It's a lot more advanced now than what it was, say, 10 years ago, when getting yourself registered for a project was a lot more informal. There's a question here about what sector are you expecting to award the most projects. In terms of sectors, it will be construction, largely because construction is the most active sector, and it's also the largest number of projects are within the construction sector. That doesn't necessarily mean that the construction sector will have the largest contract awards, but in terms of large number of contracts, it will be construction. An interesting question here: is financial liquidity available? We're seeing a big push in NEOM for export credit agency finance, along with scope reduction of active tenders. I think liquidity will be a challenge. I mean, is the liquidity available? Yes, there is liquidity available. Is there enough liquidity available? I think if you look at the pipeline of projects that are planned, no, there isn't enough liquidity for everything, and ultimately there'll have to be some choices made in terms of what's actually going ahead. ECA financing, I think, is really interesting for a number of reasons. One, it's bringing external finance in and giving it a level of comfort which it may not have had if the export credit arrangement wasn't there. And importantly, I think it also brings contractors into the market as well, because it gives them a level of comfort. So if you're looking to bring in more international players, I think the ECA component is important, A, from the banking side, and B, from the contracting side as well. And then the question then says about scope reduction on active tenders. I think this is, if that's being seen, I think that will be related to this phasing question. I think inevitably, as you need to zero in on things that are actually delivered for specific deadlines, some of the things that would maybe have been nice to have maybe give way to things that are just absolutely need to have. Question here about the status of the Expo. The Expo, as I'm sure you're all aware, Saudi Arabia and Riyadh was confirmed as the host. last year. To my understanding, that's still at the planning stage. There's a talk amongst various agencies who will be responsible for delivering different things for the expo. So that's involving PIF, the Royal Commission for Riyadh City, and then also different ministries that would be involved. So there's a lot of it. It's really at the stakeholder level at the moment in terms of planning for the expo. Okay, and there's a question here: what projects are mainly focused on landscaping for softscape contractors? I think actually, if you look at this, it's slightly an obvious answer, but the very large scale developments, there's an awful lot of landscaping involved. I was lucky enough last year to go to the nursery at the Red Sea project, and they say that's the largest nursery and migration of plants in the world. So it's an enormous amount of plants and landscaping that's required for that project alone. If you then look at Neon, which is even bigger, or even Derria or Kidia, which we discussed earlier, there's huge areas of land which need to be landscaped and softscaped and vegetated and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of potential there going forward. Interestingly, it seems that some of the restrictions that there were in terms of importing plants and using plants in the kingdom are being relaxed in certain areas as well. So I think that's quite an interesting space, although a little bit niche. I'm gonna, as we're running out of time, I'm gonna take one last question, which is a little bit of a favorite of mine, which is asking about the land bridge, which is a major rail project which has the ultimate aim really of connecting the Red Sea coast with the Gulf. So that's a railway that will just traverse the Saudi Arabia from left to right or right to left, depending on where you start, going through Riyadh. There's existing railway line between Riyadh and the Gulf. So the main section that we're talking about is from Riyadh to Jeddah and up to the King Abdullah Economic City and some other places on the Red Sea. That's been talked about for a very long time, this project. I would say the best part of 15, 20 years. They appointed a PMC team last year, which was Ital Fair and Hill International. So that was a major moment. And also they're in the final stages of talks with a contracting consortium, which is a Chinese-led contracting consortium, which has been ongoing for, I would say, about 3 years. And that looks like that's about to be converted into an actual contract award fairly shortly. So that's really quite an important project. I think that was going ahead anyway, but just to flick back to that question about the Red Sea and tensions there, I think the business case for the land bridge is only strengthened given what's been going on in the Red Sea at the moment. And I think across the region, you're seeing greater emphasis being put on rail. I think if the region wants to truly achieve its economic potential, it needs to be a lot more integrated, and rail plays a very important part if you want to move goods, services and people around the region and really deliver on your economic objectives. So yes, I think the land bridge is happening, and it should be happening fairly soon. I'm seeing quite a few positive signs there. And with that, that's the end of the webinar. We ran out of time fairly quickly, so I apologize if I didn't get to everybody's question. And if I'd just like to remind you, we've got a number of things to be aware of. Just to state it again, there's the Giga Projects, the Saudi Giga Projects event and MENA Construction Summit in May. And also there's the Saudi Giga Projects report, which is now available and with a discount if you order it before 5th of February. And with that, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for listening.